Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Angola rolls out the red carpet for Joe Biden's last-ditch trip to Africa.
The United States is all in on Africa. All in on Africa.
With just over a month left in office, what does Biden's trip reveal about the U.S.'s scramble to reassert itself in the continent? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take.
My name is Claudio Silva. I'm a journalist and a political analyst living and working in Luanda, which is also the city I was born in.
Well, Claudio, welcome to The Take. We're really glad to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Claudio, as you just mentioned, you're in Luanda, which is the capital of Angola, as the country is welcoming the first and only visit of outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden. This is the first time that he's coming to sub-Saharan Africa. So what do things look like on the ground where you are?
So President Joe Biden landed in Luanda, and the city was chaotic because many roads were closed. Citizens were not given advance warnings about which roads would be closed. They kind of got a late heads up from the local government. The government also decided that they would decree 2 days of public holiday. We call it in Portuguese tolerância do ponto, which means that you don't have to go to work. It's optional, but they would rather you stay home. So the streets right now are very quiet. It has holiday vibes written all over it.
Wow. So just because of Biden's visit, they have closed down streets and people don't have to go to work. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
On our end, it definitely bears mentioning that, we know that this trip has been long awaited. And in the U.S., it's sort of been overshadowed by Biden pardoning his son, Hunter Biden, like before he got on the plane for his trip. What are your thoughts on that? And has it taken any steam out of Biden's long-awaited trip?
I was not expecting, and I think many people were not expecting Biden to pardon his son. And he decided to do that right before a historic trip to the continent. I think the timing was off. But here in Angola, people don't talk about that, don't really care about that. Nothing has changed. Nothing has taken away from the historic nature of the trip. And the Angolan government is taking full advantage, going full propaganda with the visits. In the United States, it's different. It's kind of almost like people forgot that Biden stepped out of the country and are just talking about the pardon. It wasn't the best timing from the African point of view.
It wasn't the best timing from the African point of view. But as you say, still, even though there may be some attention being diverted here in the U.S., we know his trip has been highly anticipated in Angola. Why is this trip being treated as such a big deal there?
It's being treated as a big deal precisely because it's the first time in our 50-year history that an American president has come to the country. But you also have to remember that the United States and Angola have had a on and off relationship for decades. Because of the convoluted, absurdist nature of our Civil War, the American government actually funded and supported the rebel faction here in Angola. So the political movement, rebel movement, if you will, called UNITA, since before Angolan independence in 1975, was historically backed by the United States, covertly and overtly, against the communist-backed MPLA. So the MPLA was backed by Cuba and Russia, whereas UNITA was backed by the United States and the apartheid regime from South Africa. So that makes for some really awkward situations. The American government didn't even recognize the Angolan government until 1993, with the advent of our first multi-party democratic elections. Mm-hmm. When our civil war ended in 2002, we had a destroyed country. We needed heavy investment in infrastructure. But because the U.S. was much more interested in civil rights and democracy and rule of law, and because we have a very corrupt government, they decided not to assist us with that. So we turned to China, and China has become our biggest economic partner since the end of the Civil War. So to the tune of $45 billion over the past 20 years have been loaned or funded from China to Angola. And the United States is nowhere near that amount, or it's not even in the same conversation or in the same league.
Absolutely. And that's something we're going to dig into more in this conversation, because when people look at why the U.S. is going now, why Biden is visiting now, obviously you can't have that conversation without talking about China. It is worth noting also that President Lorenzo has been working on this relationship for a while. So having Biden come visit is a big win for him, right?
No question. It's a massive win for João Lourenço. And I actually wrote about this recently. João Lourenço began his relationship with the United States, if you will, before he became president. The Angolan government has spent around $20 million with a lobbying firm, Squire Patton Boggs, to assist them in strengthening their relationship with the United States. João Lourenço has been historically suspicious and disappointed with the nature of the loans for oil deals that he had in place, that the MPLA he had in place with China, and he thought that it was time to try something a bit different. And he had been trying systematically for the past 7 years to establish closer ties with the U.S., and it's worked out. He was at the White House with President Joe Biden, and now he finally got the president of the United States to come to Angola. So for him, a big diplomatic win.
Big win. And so Biden is finally following through on a promise that he made back in 2022 to visit Africa. And he's doing it just about as he's just about to leave office. Right. So, I guess the big question is, he's waited quite a long time to go. So why is he going now?
President Joe Biden really wants to tout the Lobito Corridor as a model for future U.S. involvement on the continent.
The United States is all in on Africa. All in on Africa. The United States is all in on Angola. We've already, my administration alone, has invested over $3 billion in Angola thus far. The future of the world is here in Africa, in Angola. So during this visit, I look forward to discussing.
This name, Lobito Corridor, has been touted out so much over the past couple of months, but what exactly is it? It is a railway that divides the country in two. It was built by the Portuguese in the early 20th century, and it was primarily used to transport minerals from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to the European market. And during the Civil War, the railway fell into disrepair, obviously. And then after the Civil War ended, it was the Chinese that rehabilitated the line. Eventually, the Angolan government decided that they wanted more investment into that infrastructure. And the United States saw a perfect opportunity for them to expand their interests. So the United States is basically providing the capital for interested companies, either from Europe or from the United States, to invest in Angolan infrastructure. That's a big play here.
Biden is going to highlight this investment while he's there. But, what's in it for the U.S.?
Biden and the United States government see this as a way of countering Chinese dominance of the infrastructure projects in Africa. China has been the major world power that has been financing railways, highways, football stadiums, you name it, China has built it. And the United States was eager to jump on that opportunity because the United States has been lagging in the continent. They haven't made any significant investments of note. They haven't been nowhere near as pragmatic as the Chinese. The United States will come to a country and talk about human rights and democracy, kind of in a paternalistic tone, and many African leaders don't particularly appreciate that. Whereas the Chinese just come with cold, hard cash and a willingness to build. They bring their own companies, they bring their own workers, and they get it done. Whether or not it lasts or has quality is a different conversation.
Right. I mean, the U.S. has built relations with Africa in the past through trade, through security, obviously with humanitarian aid. But this railway project is really kind of it's a different kind of move,
sure.
Right? I mean, this helps the U.S. Secure more access over critical minerals from Angola. We're talking about copper and cobalt that's coming out of the DRC. It's along the 800-mile corridor to Lobito, which is a port city. it's in the West. How are Angola and its people meant to benefit from it?
So this is following an old colonial model of extraction, right? Extracting resources from the African continent just for export to other markets, namely the European and the American markets. Our challenge, what we have to do as Angolans, is develop these minerals in our own country, or at least have some kind of industry that would add value to what's passing through the Lobito Corridor railway line. We have the opportunity here to build entire new industries, especially in the agricultural sector, in the energy sector, that will make use of this infrastructure. The Portuguese at the time in the early 20th century decided to build this because Angola is a rich country when it comes to quality of its soils, when it comes to its natural resources. But that's not enough. That's based on just exporting, like I said. Once we start to transform these raw materials, that's where we can really add value and create wealth for ourselves.
More with Claudio after the break. Claudio, as we mentioned earlier, China has been a major player since the end of Angola's civil war in 2002. And Angola is a place where the U.S. sees tremendous opportunity to counter China's growing influence in Africa. You touched on this a bit earlier, but tell me about the context that the Lobito Corridor investment is happening in. What does China's influence in Angola in the region actually look like?
Here in Angola, the Chinese have visible investments, and their presence is visible in every single one of our 18 provinces. Whereas if you ask somebody about American involvement in Angola, and the people in the street won't be able to reply to you because it's not visible. It's not something that we feel in our day-to-day. China is responsible for funding Angola's reconstruction after the Civil War. It's as simple as that. And they did it in a way that benefited China as well, because they built massive housing projects with Chinese labor and Chinese companies and Chinese materials. In the years after the Civil War ended, our ports were just inundated with material coming from China. And they made several billion-dollar loans to Angola in return for oil, especially, to the point that a high percentage of our oil production goes directly to China, which means we can't sell it in the open market. And President João Lourenço felt that put us in a vulnerable spot. And because of how corrupt our government is and was, a lot of these deals made with Chinese companies and Chinese state-owned companies and Chinese private companies didn't result in lasting infrastructure. The Chinese built buildings, massive housing projects that are now in dire straits, and they were not done with the quality necessary. So the Angolan government has to spend more money to fix problems that were already supposed to be fixed. And the current Angolan government, this current administration, which is the same political party as it's always been since independence, is trying to steer away from that.
I always find it sort of I've read articles about how also you even see kind of China's cultural influence there.
Mm-hmm.
Like people are learning Mandarin, for example, and you see signs that are in Mandarin. So in addition to the major investments, financial investments that China has made in Angola, you also start to really feel the cultural impact as well.
For sure. The Chinese are heavily involved in commerce here in Angola. There was a time here in Angola where we had about at least 300,000 Chinese people living around the country.
Well,
That number has considerably decreased, but it's still a noticeable presence. The Chinese are here to stay. Many of them came here to open their own private businesses. They had nothing to do with the Chinese state, and they've stayed here.
That's interesting, and obviously people are aware of the Chinese investment in the country, on the continent. So Angola finds itself in a really interesting position between U.S. interests and Chinese interests.
That is correct.
And so, looking ahead, it's hard to predict what's going to happen, as Trump retakes the White House. He's notoriously unpredictable. But do you have any thoughts on how things might change when Trump takes office in January?
Just like you mentioned, I think that it's kind of futile to try to predict what Trump would do because he's a completely unconventional, reactive, bombastic president that does not adhere to normal diplomatic culture at all, does not carry himself like a head of state, and he's very influenceable. So whoever had his ear in the last 5 minutes is who he's going to believe. He's not well read. He's not well traveled. He probably can't name more than 5 African countries, much less point them out on a map. However, the Lobito Corridor, for example, is a nice model for the types of investments that the United States wants to do in the African continent. And it's part of a broader initiative from the United States to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. Because Trump is so antagonistic against China, he might see this just as another form of competition and leave it alone. It all depends on the team that he surrounds himself with.
It's funny you mentioned that about whether he could name all the countries. I seem to recall that he made up the name of a country
Nambia.
Once. Nambia, not a real country in Africa. So this is all part of U.S.'s strategy to counter China's influence. But China is, as you've said, in so many ways, it's so entrenched in the region. They've helped build roads, they've restored railways, they built an airport. Angolans are learning Mandarin. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is visiting in his last month of his presidency. Do you think that this visit from Biden is going to restore his legacy in Africa?
I think it's too little too late, unfortunately. I mean, no American head of state has come to the African continent since 2015. Meanwhile, leaders from other countries, notably China and Turkey and United Arab Emirates, have made multiple trips to the continent and backed it up with solid infrastructure projects and infrastructure development in multiple African countries. And if the United States wants to compete on the global stage, then they're going to have to do more than these periodic, once a decade visits. And Biden now is 1 month away from leaving the presidency. The unpredictability of current American politics and the deterioration of that democracy as well has had visible impacts around the world. And this is one of them, the lack of attention that America pays to the continent. And I feel as well that the African countries have agencies, African leaders have agency. Many of our countries here in the continent are non-aligned. They don't go particularly to the west, if you will, or particularly to the east. They maintain relationships with different countries, and they become quite pragmatic. And many of them don't feel like they have to depend on the West, as they like to say. I mean, just look at what happened in the Sahel region with the amount of countries that staged coups d'états, Mali and Guinea, and places that France, for example, had so much influence over the past century, and now it's completely gone in the blink of an eye. So the United States has to step up if they want to continue to be relevant in the continent, because it will also be overtaken by other world powers, or even emerging world powers.
And that's The Take. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the Al Jazeera English channel to get all the latest. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you here tomorrow.